We had a lot of different perspectives in our group, and we had some lessons learned that I did not see coming. We did a lot of prep on this and talked through a lot of scenarios, and we got a bunch of different things that we didn't have documented initially. And I think one of the key takeaways from our group was it's not a generic data governance policy, it's our data governance policy. The things that make our association unique and different are the things we really want to document in our policy that matter most to us. That's why we need to write our own policy. We can't just take an off-the-shelf document and use it. We've got to think through some of these unique things. That for me was a key takeaway when people said, this is why it matters to me. And I was like, oh, I totally get why that matters.
Okay. Anything anything to share, by way of, I mean, we'll get the document anyway, but by way of standards or just an example of one of those perspectives on quality that would be useful to share with the group.
Is this my 5-minute wrap up or 3-minute wrap up?
This is your 3-minute wrap up. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we not only documented, we also went through and highlighted some things we thought were important, and I will briefly summarize them. One, we talked about for data quality, email address is key. We've got to have email address for everybody. And then there's a lot of other demographics that are nice. And we decided we want to make it as easy as we can for people to join our association. And we will progressively profile them, we'll prop fuel them, we'll email them to get more demographics over time. But making it easy was key. We talked about member retention, and we sort of broke it down into a couple different buckets. One was like active members, keep their data as long as they're active. We said non-active members, and we actually talked about why having non-active member email addresses might be a negative. Right? I think it was Amanda who said, if I'm not a member anymore and you keep emailing me, that's a turnoff, and I'm going to unsubscribe, and it actually might not be very helpful. And I think Zdenek said, as an organization, we have records that we have to keep. If somebody won an award, a prestigious award 50 years ago, we have to maintain that record. So there were sort of things that we need to keep forever. We talked about data integrity, and we said something is if it's not in Salesforce, it didn't happen. The database is king. If we don't have that record, it did not occur. Just because some other system says it happened doesn't mean it happened. If we can't see it in our main databases, it didn't happen. And I thought one of our key takeaways specifically around retention was it's not a negative that we have a data retention policy. It's a positive. It benefits our organization. It makes sure we have happy people who are members. It makes sure we're not annoying non-members and pushing them away. And it also helps our sender reputation. So we thought about our policy not as restrictive, but as actually empowering us and helping us stay within a good framework that we all agree upon.
Awesome. Anybody have questions about that before we move on to definitions? All right, Julie, you're up. Your 3 minutes starts now.
Okay. All right. So the first thing we realized is you don't need a template. You don't need to overcomplicate it. I did some headings based on when Bill was talking, and all it was the team, the term, really the data source, and some notes, and then the definition. There were 5 steps that we identified. First, you just gather the terms. So you look at reports, you talk to people, and you make a big list of all of the terms, and don't necessarily worry about the definitions because you'll get stuck early. Then you go by and you can sort by the terms and start to make the definitions. And so we did a couple, and right away we learned that some people might be defining things in different ways. And there were 3 key ways, right, that we could resolve this. One, we adopt one definition that already exists. 2, we rename the definition. So you shouldn't have, 3 definitions of a new member. You change that definition to mirror what you're actually defining. And that's important because I think oftentimes that's missed. And then you don't really get any benefit, or you don't get that benefit certainly out of having the document. And so you find those conflicting definitions, you then get final approval. And then we noticed that sometimes this is where your data dictionary might die. And this is where it's supposed to get the most value and benefit. And so you need to make sure you publish it in an area that everybody knows about, talk about it frequently, talk about how to use it, and keep it up to date. And so, we talked about different ways that you can store it. I think the recommended way that came out of our group was a wiki page, because it can be updated and it doesn't get all these different Excel versions or Word versions. So that was one of the big, I think, highlights. Is it was simple. We threw some definitions. We now have it on a wiki page, and we can continue to build from there. The other one that was a key tip that the group wanted to share with everybody was make sure you're not just defining what the term is, you're also defining what it is not. And so therefore assumptions can't be made. And so you're saying, you know, a learner is somebody that is in a certification program. They are not somebody who joins a one-off webinar, and not somebody who joins just one event, if that's how you're truly defining it. So those were our key findings, really, you know, 5 steps to get there. Super easy, start and continue to update it.
All right, awesome. Anybody have a question about definitions before we move on? All right, so my section.
I just posted in the chat, but do you have any suggestions on how to set up that wiki page? We were actually just addressing that.
I do have a couple pointers on structure. I'll post them in the chat.
Okay, that's something we can include in the follow-up, though, because I think that's actually a really practical tips are things that we're trying to do as much of that as we can. So I think that's a really good one. So kudos to whoever suggested that in your group. Okay, so mine was ownership. And to be honest, I mean, I felt like my group already kind of knew about all of this. So we went through just some basic definitions, or what are some of the roles and responsibilities within data governance. So there's a committee, right, or like a steering committee, or some kind of fancy name that you call the people that bless the changes and bless the policy, make the decisions. If you can get a couple of senior leaders on that, you're doing great. If you can't, a single executive sponsor can sometimes work. There's something called a process manager. If you do governance in your association, a lot of the people on the phone here would probably be the process managers. They're the ones has to kind of manage all the stuff as we go through the process. And then we spent most of our time talking about 2 key roles, which are the data stewards and the data custodians. And those are just kind of names that we use for the business owner and the IT owner of each one of your systems, right? So we talked about what each one of those mean. And we talked about a data source inventory, which is basically just a list of all of the data sources that you use. And, in my group, again, it was like people just like, yeah, Bill, this is great, but, when do we get to the hard part? But really, that's really all there is to it, is list all of the key source systems that you have, and really pay attention to what are the contents of those, what's the scope of the data that's contained in that system, and then who are the relevant owners for the business, right, to make sure that it's correct, that the business rules are reflected and all of that. And then the IT side, the technical side, which is changes in systems, upgrades, things like that. So generally what we found is a couple of key things. One is that usually there's like a group, or IT generally is kind of the same owner for most or all of the systems that'll be on your inventory. But the other ones, in the AMS in particular, because it has multiple modules, you're probably not going to have just one system owner for that, right? Because your AMS, it does membership, it does dues, it does sales, does events, does certifications, all sorts of different things. Each one of those potentially, fundraising maybe, each one of those could potentially have its own business owner. So pay attention to all of that. We started to get into some of the point-to-point integrations that happen between those systems, right? So how does data get exchanged between those systems? And I would say when you first start, if you don't get to that at all, it's okay. Over time, you can describe it in words, and then eventually you can create some fancy diagrams, right, that show the flow of data between systems, but whatever a few smart people can come up with in a 1-hour meeting to get started is probably enough to put together for a framework. Okay.
So 1 second, because in quality, we talked about something related to what you just said, which was, email address opt-outs and it being consistent across all of our platforms. If you opt out in one platform, that shouldn't then allow me to send an email in another platform. And that was one of those things we talked about with data integrity, is if we're going to have multiple systems, we have to make sure some of our key functional things match between the systems, and opt-out was a huge one that was brought up.
Yeah, I mean, and the reality is, if you don't have the integrations or they're not working properly, some of those things fall through the cracks. For governance purposes, it's obviously good to have some rules, or at least some ideals, around that. But if it doesn't work perfectly, then don't let that deter you, of course. All right, Emilio, what did we learn about usage?
Yeah, there's a lot of fantastic perspective and comments from the group. We didn't walk away with like a 5-point plan like Julie's group did about what to do regarding collection and usage, but definitely appreciating a lot of the complexities. So some of the themes that came out of our conversation was the idea of, having something of a life expectancy for new data that's brought in, especially if it comes from an outside source. So basically, in the example of like an email list, if you're getting contacts from somewhere else, being able to really track the performance of that group, understand when they were added to the system, when to remove records due to a lack of activity, et cetera. That can be a great asset for organizations that are bringing in data from other sources, really thinking about what we do with it and keeping track of that group of data. We also talked about the idea of another reason why tracking collection and usage is so important is because organizations have information that they want from things like member surveys, et cetera. And what's the right way to get the information that you're going to use to populate records if people are under the impression with a survey that they're providing somewhat anonymous answers, and you use that as a chance to upgrade all your demographic data about them, that's kind of a morally gray area. And so how you communicate, the more intentional you can be with data governance, the better you can communicate your intentions to your audience. And that really touches on the theme of user experience. So there's all kinds of reasons to think about data usage and collection from a security and privacy perspective. We can think about the legislative bodies that are out there and all the acronyms associated with that. But having a good user experience is also a really motivating factor for having good policies around data governance. A really cool wrinkle that we talked about in the group as well is this idea that different groups within your organization might have very different desires or expectations with how data is going to be used. So the example that came up for us was this idea that maybe your membership function, really when new people join the website, maybe the membership function isn't really looking for a lot of demographic details about them and really wants to court them with the resources and material that your association offers. Whereas your marketing function might be like, give us all that demographic information as soon as possible so we can start pushing people down the right marketing pathways to get them more inculcated into the system. So, thinking about reasons why we bring people together to talk about data governance, why we put these guardrails on usage, user experience, and providing an easy to use experience for users that prevents them from leaving or being dissatisfied can be a really strong reason to rally the troops around this topic. I think those are a lot of the kind of main things we talked about, but we were really just getting started with the conversation.
All right, great. So that was interesting because to Julie's point earlier, especially with definitions, you have the affirmative as well as the negative, right? So you talked a lot about things that in the affirmative, what you should be using certain types of data for. And then I think there's also the negative, right? What you should not be using it for. And that's a really good segue to the last one, which is private, because many times that's for privacy reasons. So we'll transition now to Dilo to bring us home with privacy and security. After he unmutes.
To bring us home the fastest, we decided that it wouldn't be best for me to talk. So we actually appointed a presenter from our group. Right. I'm going to let Monica chat.
Yes, no, so we did do introductions, which I enjoyed to learn a bit about the other people in our team, and half were from the IT side, while the other, I was on the non-IT group, but I come from a certification department where privacy and security is really important for our test takers or candidates. So we learned a good deal from Dilo about the differences between security and privacy. So security are how the policies are getting enforced, whereas privacy is what data is important and why. And so some overlap there, but he gave us a ton of really good examples of what those two terms entail. And so we also dove into a couple questions. And again, we did run out of time. I think our 20 minutes felt more like 5 minutes in our group. But we looked at what systems we were using where we are dealing with personal information or PI. And of course, we ended up with 6 or 7, and we could have added to the list, but recognizing that there are many places, hosted by third parties, such as AMSs, LMSs, event registration platforms, digital badging platforms, and that a lot of our contractual protections help us. So I think what I found was that we're doing a lot of things right in our organization that we may not have put the label on, or that IT knows we're doing it, but the rest of the team may not be fully aware of what all those policies are or where to find them, which leads us to our next question that we were in the middle of discussing, was, do you know what your security procedures are, or where they are documented and where to find them? So I think that could be one of the big challenges that many of these organizations are facing. And I'll hand it over to Dilo to add anything I may have missed.
No, you did great. It's that we were just getting our conversation started. There's a lot to cover around privacy and security, and as Monica, everybody's doing a lot of things. I said it's just not wrapped up under the container of data governance. So there is contract language, there are IT security policies, there are things like encryption that do a lot of what the privacy and security aspects of data governance cover. It's just kind of that knowing where and what it is and what might be missing, and identifying some possible gaps. But we're keeping it light, so that's why I wasn't talking.
All right. So look, I mean, I think that was a pretty consistent theme that we got most of the way through in just 20 minutes. I'm going to call that a success, right? We will we'll clean it up a little bit. We'll add some things, right? Make sure we highlight the most important parts of each discussion before we share it out. But the intent, and we'll provide the questions that we were kind of working off of, even though in my group we didn't really go by them too much. But we'll provide these questions, and the idea being that you can use that to facilitate this type of discussion in your organization, and that's more than enough, considering that that almost every association that all of us know have done next to nothing when it comes to governance. If we just do this will get us a long way towards where we need to go. So with that, the key takeaways, right? Start small, start with focus, and what we mean by that is whatever the smart people that you can assemble can come up with in some kind of reasonable amount of time. I mean, that's what you start with, right? We're going to delegate. We're going to break up into these groups. We recommend these 5, but you can break it up into 5 or some amount of buckets that seem reasonable to your group. You don't have to be formal with the document. It can definitely be a wiki page or something that's on your shared drive. It doesn't have to be like some leather bound manual that's 100 pages long or anything like that. And then to my point earlier, it's not necessary. It doesn't have to be an obstacle. It can be an opportunity. So I would encourage you to look at governance as something that can be the beginning, right? That early quick win that builds momentum towards the other things that you want to do with your data, and not something necessarily that you push down the road and say, well, yeah, that's what we're going to get to next year. So yeah, that's anybody have a question or a final thought before we wrap up? We almost made it in an hour. I think we got pretty close. Anybody have a final thought?
Bill, I wanted to add 2 thoughts from my key takeaways, where data governance is personal for the association. Every association has different reasons for different policies, and talking about them with your team is going to be critical. And data governance is not restrictive, it's empowering. It gives you the opportunity of where we can use our data and how we can focus on it, and what are we capturing and why. And it wasn't a limiting thought, it was how are we going to be successful with our data. And I thought those were really interesting takeaways from my side.
All right. Anybody
So-
else? Julie, Dila?
No, I said this is a great, I agree. Just, you know, thinking of all the different years of working through data governance stuff, and the simplest things actually get done and paid attention to. So don't overthink it. It's and it never ends. So you've got to keep it somewhat light so that you can keep up with it.
All right. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate all your participation. This is our first time trying out this format. You know, it didn't go perfectly, but I think it was successful, and we will we'll try it again in the future.